Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Managerial Accounting. And the purpose of this first of two little mini lectures to review the results of exam number one. First, we'll do a separate video on the multiple choice, and then I'll do a second one on the take-home part of the exam as well. So let's just take them in the order they appear. Question number one, the primary goal of managerial accounting is to provide information to managers. Again, the whole purpose of managerial accounting is to provide useful reports to help management make decisions. So the correct answer is C. Which of the following would most likely be considered indirect material by a manufacturer? So steel, fabric, and lumber are all probably raw materials. An indirect material, most likely of that list, would be glue used to, the indirect cost would be small amount of materials that are actually the amount used on an individual job is pretty small. So if we use glue in a production, there's probably a small amount of glue that's applied. So of the choices there, glue is the best one. That would be indirect material. Cost of goods manufactured is equal to total manufacturing cost plus work in process minus the ending. That is the definition of how to get cost of goods manufactured, as you've seen, I think, in the first take-home question on the exam. Which of the following is a period cost for a bicycle manufacturer? So period costs are not costs that become part of the cost of manufacturing the item. So tires for a bicycle factory supervisory salary, electricity cost to run the factory, all of those would become part of the cost of the product. But accountant salaries would not become part of the cost of the product. And those things that don't become cost of the product for a manufacturer, we call period costs. And an example, speaking of period cost, an example of an end of a period cost of the ones given there, advertising expense would be a good example. Again, period costs are costs that do not become part of the cost of manufacturing a product. Compute the conversion cost based on the following information. So the conversion cost would be the total of direct labor and total of factory overhead. So you add those two together, as you see here, I've highlighted for you, gives you 384,200. So the answer is D. Which of the following is an indirect cost for Bartell, a producer of bar stools for restaurants? So wages, wood, leather, and used in seat cushions, those are all, those would be all direct costs. Indirect costs, it's necessary to have the supervisory salary, but the supervisory salary would be part of the overhead, would be an indirect cost. So the answer there would be B. Number 8, prime costs are material and labor. Again, those are your prime costs, material and labor, and your conversion costs are labor and overhead. Journalizing the entry for indirect labor costs incurred for general factory use would include a debit to factory overhead. So indirect labor costs become part of factory overhead. Again, we don't apply them directly to the work in process. That's a separate entry. So the actually incurring factory overhead costs for indirect labor would go into factory overhead. 10, which of the following typically used by companies that make custom products? Well, if you make custom products where it's easy to trace materials and labor to individual jobs and overhead, then you use job order costing. Number 11, the journalizing entries for jobs shipped and customers billed would include a credit to finished goods. Journalize the entries for jobs shipped and customers billed. You're going to have to reduce the finished goods. So remember, the flow would be goes from work in process into finished goods. And then finished goods is an inventory account, an asset account with a debit balance. So when you reduce that, you're going to have to credit it. So the answer there is C, finished goods. Number 12, a manufacturer of which of the following products would most likely use job order costing? So remember, job order costing is when you do small jobs where it's easy, or customized jobs where you trace the materials, labor, and overhead to individual jobs. So of those ones given here, the one that would most likely to use job order costing would be graduation invitation, because that would be customized to the individual who is graduating. Cell phone, highlighter, pen, recliner, those would more likely use process costing because they're a large number of homogeneous goods. 13, in job order costing, the journal entry to record the flow of direct materials into production consists of a debit to work in process and a credit to materials. As you would have seen in, I believe, was problem 2 of the take home. the journal entries, when you actually put materials into production, it goes into work in process, debit work in process, credit materials. 14, the salary of a director of internal auditing, that would be a period cost. And obviously, the auditor is not a salesman. I think of my marketing professor reminding me that the marketing was more important than accounting. I used to argue with him on that. So the internal auditing cost would be a period cost, and that would be an administrative expense. Internal audited company has its own auditors that review transactions, try to ferret out errors, and that would be an administrative. It's a period cost, but it's administrative. So the answer is D. The document authorizing the issuance of materials from the storeroom, that's called a materials requisition. So the answer is A. The amount of factory overhead costs incurred exceeds the amount applied, then you're going to have a debit balance in overhead, and that's going to be under applied. Remember, set up an overhead account, a T account, you debit it for the costs incurred, you credit it for the costs applied. So if you've got the amount incurred actually larger than the amount implied, you've got a debit balance of the account, and that represents under applied overhead. So what you do at the end of the period is you would reduce that overhead account and pick it up as additional cost of goods sold. So the answer there, 16, is A. Okay, some of the calculations now. The following production data were taken from the records of the finishing department for June. So they give us the beginning inventory, the completed units during June, and they give us the ending inventory. The number of conversion equivalent units for production of the June 30th inventory. So I've highlighted June 30th finishing inventory. So it's 7,000 units that are 60% complete. So it's 4,200. So the answer there is D. 18, Department W had 2,400 units, 1/3 complete at the beginning of the period. 16,000 units were transferred to Department X from Department W during the period, and 1,800 units were 1/2 complete at the end of the period. Assume the completion ratios apply to direct materials and to conversion costs. The equivalent units of production used to compute the conversion costs on the cost of production report for W, assuming that FIFO was used. So the equivalent units for conversion costs would be 2,400, which is the units 1/3 complete. So 2,400. So if they were 1/3 complete at the beginning of the period, then you've got 2/3 complete during the current period. And then the started and completed would be the units transferred minus what you had in beginning inventory. So that's 1,600 minus 24. And then you take the 1,800 units that were left over, but those 1,800 units were 1/2 complete at the end of the period. So you multiply that by 1/2. So you come up with 16,100. Again, for these computational ones, do the computation first, then go looking for the correct answer. All right, so the answer there is A, 16,100. 19, in the manufacture of 10,000 units of product, the direct materials costs incurred were 165, direct labor costs incurred were 105, and factory overhead. Conversion costs would be the total of the labor and of the overhead, so that's 105 plus 53, which gives you 158, which is B. 20, in process costing, the amount of work in process inventory would be valued by allocating departmental costs between completed and partially completed units. So you did that in the take-home exam. I forget what number it was. I think it may have been number 3 that you did that. So in the process costing, the amount of work in process inventory is valued by allocating departmental costs between completed and partially completed units. 21. Department W had 2,400 units, 1/3 complete at the beginning of the period. 16,000 units were transferred to Department X. From W during the period, 1,800 units were 1/2 complete at the end of the period. Assume the completion ratios applies to the conversion cost. The number of units to be assigned would be the 2,400, which is you had at the beginning of the period. This is units assigned. They didn't ask the number of units to be assigned cost. So it'd be 2,400, which was the beginning. And then you've got the started and completed during the period, and you got 1,800 units left over. So this is the number of units to have to account for. This is not the equivalent units. So the total number of units to be assigned cost are 17,800. 22, which of the following would most likely use job order costing? So paper, flour, and gasoline refinery. You're producing a large number of homogeneous goods, so those would likely be processed. Movie studio, some of those actor salaries can be pretty hefty, so you're going to use job order costing there for a movie studio. 23, process costing would be appropriate for any time you manufacture a large number of units that are homogeneous. So jet airline builder, catering business, custom cabinet maker, there you're going to trace material and labor and overhead to individual jobs. Natural gas, it's whatever you measure natural gas in terms of barrels or feet or something like that, they would use process. That's a classic example of process costing anytime you're in a refinery environment. 24, which of the following is uncharacteristic of processing costing? So several work in process accounts are used. That's true. Manufacturing costs are grouped by department rather than job. That's true. Perpetual inventory system is maintained for materials, work in process, finished goods. That's probably true. So which of the following is uncharacteristic of process costing? You don't really accumulate costs by job. You accumulate costs by departments, not by job. So the answer there is C. 25, Challenger produces two similar products, regular widgets and deluxe widgets. The total factory overhead budget is $675,000 with 300,000 estimated direct labor hours. Deluxe widget requires 3 direct labor hours per unit and regular widget requires 2 hours. Using a single plant-wide rate with an allocation base of direct hours, the factory overhead that Challenger factory will allocate to deluxe widget is budgeted for the period is 50,000 units, and the actual production is 58,000 units. So what you need to do is, if they want the actual production here is 58,000 units, and each unit requires 3 hours to direct, requires 3 hours, so you have to get 58,000 units times 3, and you have to figure out what the overhead rate is. And the overhead rate is 675 divided by 300,000 direct labor hours. So 675 divided by 300,000 gives you 225, and it's 225, and you manufacture 58,000 units, but each unit requires 3 hours of direct labor. So your correct answer is 391,500, which is A. Boston factory has budgeted factory overhead of 13,500,000 and budgeted direct labor hours for the year are 10 million. If actual overhead labor for the month are 350, the overhead allocated for May is okay. So what you do here is you get the overhead rate, which is the 13,510 divided by the number of hours, so you get 135 an hour, and you're going to apply the overhead not based on the estimate, but you're going to base it on the actual number of hours. So the actual number of hours in May were 350. 350 times 1.35 gives you 472,500. So the answer there is C. 27, which of the following are actual factory overhead allocation methods? So plant-wide, multiple production, and activity-based. Those are the 3 methods that we reviewed. And remember, we did that for the snowmobiles and for the riding mowers. So single plant-wide rate, multiple department rate, and activity-based. So the answer there is A. 28, which of the following is a reason for banks to use weighted average costing? Well, it determines both the amounts to charge and the profitability of services provided. So that's why a service organization would use activity-based costing. And there is no 29, I noticed that. So skipping ahead to number 30, if selling and administrative expenses are allocated for different products for decision-making, they should be reported in the financial statements as they're not part of the cost of goods manufactured, they're not factory overhead, they're not part of cost of goods sold. Selling and administrative expenses are period costs. Okay, so I hope you found that review of the multiple choice part of the exam useful, and I'll do a separate little video on the take-home part of the exam. So until next time, adios, au revoir, hasta luego. We'll see you again soon for the review of the problem, the take-home parts. Be well, everybody.